for those of you who are able to join us today for what is the third session of our 9-part series, Best Practices for Working with Refugee and Immigrant Youth. We will be hearing today about the forced migration experience topic. As you may know from attending one or both of our previous sessions, these sessions are a part of a 9-part series being put on by the staff and faculty here at the Trauma and Community Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, with support from SAMHSA as a part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Already, by joining us here today for this session, you'll be receiving more information about our upcoming sessions, including our next session, which is taking place on Monday, April 11th at noon Eastern. And that presentation will be on the topic of refugee and immigrant core stressors and strengths. If you missed either or both of our first 2 sessions, have no fear. We are going to populate the link to the recordings in the chat so you can catch those when you are able to. This session today will be added to our YouTube channel in the coming days as well. All the sessions in our 9-part series are intended for mental health professionals. However, it is open to everyone. The series was created to be introductory level and interactive. However, because we have such a large group today, which is wonderful, we do ask that you keep yourselves muted throughout today's session. We do very much strongly encourage comments and questions being put to the chat. We will be having a Q&A after today's presentation for the last half. And I really hope it will be a very engaging and interesting discussion. If you have any technical issues or administration questions, please direct them to our colleague, Osab Isa, if things come up throughout the session. In the coming days after today's session, you'll be receiving a follow-up email with a copy of our slides, the link to the recording, and if you are a social worker or psychologist, a link to a post survey to initiate the process of receiving your CEUs. So again, that's yes, you can absolutely have the slides, recording, and you will be receiving CEUs. Before we begin today's presentation, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement, which reminds us that colonization is an enduring reality and recognizes the traditional lands on which we live, work, and study. We are here in Massachusetts, and as such, we recognize that this land was home to the Mashpee Wampanoag, Akina Wampanoag, Mimpuk, and Massachusetts tribal nations. My apologies for incorrect pronunciations there. We also acknowledge the legacy of slavery in our region and the enslaved African people whose labor was exploited for generations to help establish the economy of our region and the United States. We ask you to join us in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations, and acknowledge that Massachusetts was founded upon exclusions and erasures for many Indigenous and African peoples. Now, to kick off today's presentation, I will begin this session actually by introducing myself. My name is Caroline Polesky, she, her, hers. I'm a clinical social worker here at the Trauma and Community Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. I come with previous experience in refugee resettlement and with unaccompanied minor populations. And now I will turn it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves. Vanya?
Thanks, Caroline. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to have you. My name is Vanya Page. I'm trained as a school psychologist here at our center. I use she, her pronouns, and I come into the space today both from a personal experience as a former refugee myself who's experienced forced migration, and I worked heavily with refugee populations over the last 10 years. And I'll pass it over to Doris.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so very much for being here today. My name is Doris Limus. I was born and raised in El Salvador. I came to the United States in 2013, and I graduated from Summerbrook High School in 2017, and I'm currently in college for psychology. And I am very, very happy to be here today and provide all the knowledge that I have for my own experience. And I would pass it to Caroline.
Thank you both. Just to start diving into our content, learning objectives for today's presentation is to learn the 3 stages of the migration journey and how it affects the process for different refugee and immigrant populations, as well as begin to comprehend critical strategies for conceptualizing the migration experience for refugee and immigrants. Our agenda for today is just a quick orientation to population. We'll be going over some definitions, as language is really important in this topic. We will then go over the different phases of the migration journey using a socio-ecological framework. Doris will then share her own lived experience with us, and then we'll be wrapping up with question and discussion. Just to get us kind of warmed up for today, we would like to begin with a fun activity, just to kind of look at busting some myths around this process. It's completely anonymous, it's just for fun, but I am going to have a poll pop up for us. So quick true-false questions. And I'll give folks a few minutes to answer them, and then we'll go over the correct answers.
Number 3 is confusing, the way it's written. FYI.
Absolutely, we'll go over it. Thank you. It should be cross, not crossing, cross, if that helps. Okay, so thank you for those of you who answered. If you weren't able to answer, I apologize, but we're going to go over it. So it does look like folks are pretty familiar with this topic already, which is great. Out of interest, so folks know the correct answers for number 1 is false. Not all unaccompanied minors are orphans. Some may be without either or both parents. It is possible. But all have traveled and entered the U.S. alone, some in search of reunification with a parent who might have entered before them. Some may be hoping to connect with a sponsor. But for all youth, especially those crossing the U.S.-Mexico border from Central America, they often have a family member or someone they know already living in the United States, even if they don't end up living with them. Number 2, and then just to add, that people may be leaving unhealthy family situations, but it's also equally true that they come from supportive and loving families. Number 2 is also false. Not all refugees have lived in refugee camps. Throughout today's training, we're going to use the legal definition of refugee, which we'll get into in a moment, but we're speaking here of refugee with a capital R, which is a legal definition. And so the statistic here is from the UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the Refugee Agency section of the United Nations. 22% of the world's refugee population live in refugee camps. 6.6 million people is kind of what that percentage translates down to. Among them, 4.5 million reside in planned and managed camps. Then approximately 2 million are in sheltered, self-settled sites. I personally know of unaccompanied refugee minors, for example, who were living in apartments unsupervised in Cairo, but were still registered with the UNHCR. Number 3, again, folks were in the know about this one as well. Mexican migrants were primarily the largest group seen crossing the US-Mexico border until about 2014, when we started to see really big influxes from Central America. A Washington Post article from 2021 highlights that this has exacerbated by the pandemic. It's changed a lot, especially in these last 2 years, rising numbers from Cuba, Haiti, Brazil, Venezuela, and Ecuador even surpassing Central American migrants at some points. But it's also not unheard of to see immigrants crossing the US southern border from places like Bulgaria, mostly Roma people. And I've personally seen and known immigrants to cross the US southern border from Pakistan and even Somalia. Number 4 is false. A green card, or LPR, lawful permanent residency, offers the ability to lawfully live and work within the U.S. While there are a number of pathways to a green card, including family sponsorship, employment, and adjustment of status, refugee and asylee, just to name a few. No pathway is without its challenges, certainly, and navigating the U.S. immigration system is lengthy, confusing, and typically expensive for almost everyone. In 2021, the American Immigration Council put out a fact sheet that really highlights this idea that there is no line, there is no pathway, especially for many undocumented immigrants, including, you might have heard, TPS, temporary protective status, or DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals. Many wish to have family sponsor them. Not all relationships are eligible for family sponsorship. And depending on your country, the US has a certain allotment of visas it gives out per year and a certain amount per country that's not uniform across all countries. Even if you get through all of that, for family sponsorship specifically, that process can take upwards of even 15 to 20 years at some times, which not only is an incredibly difficult time to be separated from your family, it can also be too long if you are in fear. And last but not least, number 5 is also false. In general, refugees can begin the application process to apply for a green card 1 year after arrival, asylum seekers 1 year after a one asylum case, and in different humanitarian groups, special immigrant juveniles, for example, have to wait 5 years after arriving to the US. Again, once you submit those applications, things can be unpredictable, and there's certainly a lot of nuance and definitely not uniformity for everyone, even within those groups. Next slide, please. So just to begin looking at things from a global scale, 82.4 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. 26.4 million are refugees. Approximately half of that number, of the refugee number, are children. And specifically in the US context in 2021, just under 12,000 refugees entered the US. Despite there being changes to Biden's refugee admissions cap to about 62,000 in 2021, there was only just around 12,000 admitted. It's also worth noting that these numbers are changing almost daily at this point, especially with all the news we've seen with different crises happening, including Ukraine and many other parts of the world. Also, as we'll kind of look at both the refugee experience and immigrant experience, worth mentioning 6,000 undocumented immigrants were apprehended daily at the US southern border in 2021, and about 11,000 unaccompanied children were in custody in 2021 as well. Next slide, please. So again, like I mentioned, language can be really important and again, very nuanced here. It seems to be we have a very in the know crowd, which is great, but just to kind of review, we'll be speaking here again about the legal definition differentiated by an uppercase R, which is different from refugee, which is kind of more generally used. That refers to anyone forced to leave their home to escape war, persecution, or national disaster. The uppercase R, refugee, a person who is unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of their former country due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 things: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is a formal definition that came about from a 1951 United Nations Convention. As sort of an overall caveat to all of these definitions, it is meant to be introductory. I am not an immigration lawyer, and a lot of these change pretty frequently, which is not only confusing to us all as providers, but incredibly confusing and stressful for clients. When I say legal definition, we're referring to legal status. Also can be a very confusing topic. The best sort of metaphor I've been able to think of is sort of how you file your taxes, single, married, head of household. It's sort of those types of statuses that relate to different rights and benefits, but it's not a perfect fit. And I certainly don't know everything about my taxes, if you do, but very confusing parts of the law, both tax and immigration. Also worth mentioning here that the LGBTQ individuals in most cases are falling under particular social group membership. Clinical implications, like all groups, knowing the rights and benefits that refugees are allowed can be really beneficial for providers. And I feel the current crisis in Ukraine has really brought to light something that has always been true, but that refugees can be skilled or unskilled workers. They can speak English. They may not know English. They can be white, Black, Christian, Muslim, really can be you or me. And so taking the time to practice kind of the cultural humility, which was our previous session on doing a little bit background knowledge on the home countries of clients, can go a long way in a clinical setting. In a legal setting, in particular, we'll be speaking of the US context, as it does differ in different countries. Refugee legal status in the United States makes one eligible for work almost immediately upon arrival, eligibility for public benefits, and can start that green card process about a year after arrival if everything kind of goes according to plan. Always sort of exceptions to the rule. Next slide, please. Asylum seeker. The way I like to think of the definition of asylum seeker is one who crosses into a secondary or even a third country on their own accord. No one is formally arranging it for them, and then requests to be safeguarded. You're claiming and petitioning for asylum. After that's done, then you're otherwise meeting the definition of the refugee for one of those 5 pieces that I just mentioned. Well-founded fear of persecution for race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. An example of this may be a person fleeing different countries in Latin America, making their way to the US-Mexico border and claiming asylum once crossing over the border. The clinical implications is that asylees have open court cases with immigration court. They're petitioning for a judge to agree with them that they do have this well-founded fear. As providers, it's important to know that Asylees have to go into court and tell essentially their trauma narrative. And as we know, not only is this really re-triggering and traumatizing in and of itself, it can also be very weighted and heavy because the outcome of your case can feel like it decides your fate if you get to stay safely or risk being deported. Asylum seekers, again, most cases are eligible to work once their case is won, or there can be, if you have a pending application for a prolonged period of time as well. Public benefits, you're eligible once your case is won, and a green card 1 year after your case is won. It can be unpredictable in terms of when you're going to be able to get your hearing or not. Asylum seekers are just kind of in limbo until that point. And so we just talked about refugees and asylum seekers. These are just two of different legal statuses in the US. We're not going to get into different types of visas today, but there's certainly a lot of other options as well. What you may also see as providers that I did want to mention are undocumented immigrants. A definition of an undocumented immigrant is someone who enters the United States without proper authorization, documents, or enters legally and then overstays their visa. I've always found it really interesting to know that statistically, actually, visa overstayers far exceed numbers of folks illegal crossing the border in the United States. Pretty much consistently year after year, about a 2-to-1 rate. As this is a youth-focused training, I also felt it was worth mentioning accompanying children can fit under this definition as well, with the addition that they're entering the United States under the age of 18 without a parent or guardian. But they also then do not have legal status. Clinically important to keep in mind that due to their lack of legal status, they may not be able to access needed services out of fear they will be reported and deported. Needed services such as reporting crimes to law enforcement, including being a witness and also a victim, as well as receiving medical care, even emergency medical care. On top of that, for, again, specifically unaccompanied children, their age and lack of legal status can make them particularly vulnerable to additional types and forms of exploitation and victimization during their journey, but also upon arrival. Unaccompanied children might be accustomed to different adult responsibilities that might contribute to a sense of loss of autonomy and independence that might not really align with different cultural norms or even laws that we have here in the United States. It can lead to additional struggle. I also like to mention the importance of language. We do not believe that any human being is illegal, nor should they be referred to as an alien. Legal implications, again, it's this living in a bit of limbo and kind of constant state of uncertainty without the ability to legally continue to reside and work here in the United States. Without eligibility for benefits, many work under the table to support themselves and their families. This is without sort of a lot of workers' rights, which again is a very risky situation, and it can be often dangerous and exploited.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. So we'll transition now. Caroline has done a nice job of giving us a context of who are the individuals that we're talking about. Now it feels important to provide a definition of when we say forced migration and displacement, what do we really mean? And essentially, what that means is there is an involuntary coerced movement of person or people from their home or home region. And this can be internally displaced people, meaning that they stay within their country, but they're displaced from their home city, home area, and or it may mean refugees who leave their country to a neighboring country, or as we'll talk about today, resettle to a whole new continent, like, coming to the United States. And as Caroline was talking about in definitions, when we think about forced migration, we're really talking about individuals who are forced to flee due to fear of persecution, due to violence in their communities, due to climate change. We're seeing more and more natural disasters. So all of these can be part of that forced migration journey. As we'll talk today extensively, journeys are very, very different from person to person. And I'm sure many of you know that you can have two individuals from the same country, and yet their journey looks very different. So it's important to keep that in mind, that as we talk today, we are going to give some big picture kind of narratives and talk about our experiences. But at the same time, every young person that walks into your office or your school will have their own story. And that's important to keep in mind. It's also important to note that traumatic loss and change is unfortunately a huge theme of many children, families that experience forced migration. Let alone the journey itself, but also what they experience in their home country. And also, as we'll talk today, what does it mean to resettle and the stressors of that experience. And finally, it's important to keep in mind that often a common goal of all individuals who've been displaced is really to have a better, safer life for themselves, for their families, and for future generations. And the other thing I'll just like to note before we continue is that, I'm imagining that some of you on this call who may have experienced forced migration yourself or have loved ones that have experienced forced migration. So take care of yourself on this call today. This can be a hard topic and can bring up feelings for all of us. So I'm just putting that out there as well. Okay. So as we think about the forced migration experience and journeys, and we introduced this model in our first training, if you attended, on trauma and culture, it's important to kind of root it in sociological model, meaning that when we think about migration journeys, we're not only talking about the individual itself, we really have to root that experience in their family, in their community, in their peer group, in their neighborhood, and their bigger system. And that all of these really interact and bring forth how they will show up in your space when you are ready to provide services. So when we think about migration journey, we often think about it through a 3-phase model, meaning that first phase being pre-migration, so life in their home country. And again, as you can see here, we root that within this kind of sociological context, taking into account all of these systems and how they interact with each other. And then we think about the migration journey, as we'll talk today, which is, once they leave their home country, home city, that journey itself, whether it's still in their country, whether it's a neighboring country, whether it's the resettlement to somewhere else, but it's that journey that they experience. And then the third and final phase is post-migration, meaning life once they resettle into a new community. Okay. So let's start by thinking a little bit about pre-migration and what pre-migration looks like for many individuals. First, it's important to note that social and political upheaval and disruption really varies grossly across communities, meaning that if we think about Somalia, who's experienced violence since 1970s, right? That there's an ongoing social and political upheaval that young people and children are experiencing for years, right? Versus if we think about what's happening in Afghanistan, Ukraine right now, there's an immediate change to you have to leave, right? Danger. So in some places, kids and families and generations have grown up in violence, and in other places there's disruption overnight. Many have experienced exposure to war or violence of some sort in their home communities. And again, this can be ongoing, or this can be overnight. This can be from a neighbor that you've experienced violence, or this can be from somebody you've never known. So, but often that is one of the key marks that we see in terms of home life. As part of that then it's no surprise that many experience chaos and unpredictability and instability. One day things are fine, and the next day you're packing your bags and you have to leave. So that urgency and that sudden nature to leave obviously is a huge stressor for many families. There's often disruption of basic needs, right? It's not uncommon for kids to stop going to school, that schools shut down, that there is lack of access to food and shelter, that many live in bomb shelters for sometimes weeks, months, and years. And as you can see here, the top photo is actually current Ukraine. So, often, your home is unlivable, or the photo bottom here is from current Afghanistan, kind of seeing and witnessing police and military on your streets becomes kind of normal part of life. And finally, and most importantly, in this, as you can imagine, then chaos and unpredictability, it's not uncommon to be separated from loved ones and family. It's not uncommon for families to have to choose who leaves when and with who and how many can leave. And it's not uncommon for individuals to lose loved ones during all of the disruption and upheaval that's happening in their communities. So when we think about pre-migration, there are some key questions that I think could be important as providers when a child or a young person or a caregiver comes into your office. And these questions can provide a little bit of context for you of kind of where to engage in treatment and supports. So things that we like to think about is, to what degree did the child know a life of stability and normalcy prior to migration? So really thinking about this, what was life like at home for them? Do they have access to education and healthcare and security, right? Because this will matter for placement in schooling, but also supports and medical care that they may need upon resettlement. We think about, what degree of adversity and stability that the child experience. And then we think about what is the family's frame of reference of why they're resettling. Are they looking for a new opportunity? Is this a community that they chose to come to, or were they resettled here without their choice? This especially becomes important if we think about adolescents, if we think about young people that are maybe crossing the border that are reunifying with family members, or are coming here because now the loved one they used to live with has passed away and now they're reunifying with a family member. The impact of that, like, do they want to be here and what that means for them? And then also, as Caroline said, refugees, migrants, immigrants come from all walks of life. So thinking about level of loss and opportunity that caregivers have went through prior to coming, and what does that mean for them as they reconnect to a new community? Are they able to find a job? What kind of job? Does their degree matter in this country, or do they have to work a different type of job? Okay. So then we think about migration. And as I said, migration is really this phase of once they leave their home base. Migration, as we'll talk today, really varies greatly, mode of transportation, duration, and even legal ramifications that come with it. Some walk, right, for months, as we think about crossing the border, months. Others take the train. Others, if we think about, the migrant crisis over the last few years through Greece, others are taking boats. Others take a flight and come to the United States. So transportation can vary greatly, and obviously the degree of danger that comes with that transportation then varies. Duration of migration also varies. We have individuals who, like we said, can get on a plane and they're here the next day. We have individuals that have walked for months. We have individuals who have lived in refugee camps their entire life. And actually the resettlement countries the first time that they're quote unquote settling. And as similar to, Caroline talking about definitions, there's also different legal ramifications of what it means to cross and the dangers that await once you cross. The period of flight is often marked by a great degree of exhaustion and chronic danger for many, and separations from loved ones. It's not uncommon to be separated or have to leave those behind, and lots of uncertainty of what life looks like ahead. For many refugee camps that we see around the world, they are incredibly overcrowded and often have limited resources. It's not uncommon for kids to sometimes go to school and other times not, for maybe boys to go to school and girls to stay back. Healthcare can be scarce, food can be, and there's often a lot of violence in refugee camps as well. So as you can imagine, then you just live through this horrific experience pre-migration, and now migration journey itself can be just another layer of trauma stressors that you're experiencing. And then similarly, we see, you know, as immigrants cross the border, those journeys can also be incredibly, incredibly dangerous. Many pay individuals, right, coyotes, to cross them. So then once they arrive, now they owe thousands of dollars to somebody, right? So not only are you starting a new life, you're still giving money back. And there's all kinds of human rights violations that happen once individuals cross, that are detained. Often people are not told for how long. They're not giving really any kind of human rights that they need. And these are just some photos from the different journeys. So here, similar to pre-migration, it's really important as providers for us to consider how long was the journey for the individual, you know, days, months, years, or generations. You know, I remember working with, you know, Burmese refugees who sometimes, you know, the children grew up in Thailand in camps and didn't speak the same language as parents. That has huge implications for us as providers and for life for them once they arrive. Thinking about did the family stay in a refugee camp, what that experience was like, what resources and supports they had. Did the family have access to formal and informal education during migration, or was there disruption? And if there was disruption, then what does that mean for supports? What kind of trauma and or loss occurred along the way of their migration journeys? Was the family separated? Does the family have any financial obligations? This is the piece we're talking about, especially for individuals who are crossing the border. And is resettlement in this country legal, or is the family at risk of deportation? Okay. And then the last piece is post-migration. So what we mean here is once they arrive to their resettlement city or country. This process, as you can imagine, is met with new challenges, but also opportunities that, you know, many individuals feel like, okay, we can at least begin our life now. So we definitely see both. We see, as we'll see in the next few slides, many stressors the individual experience, including trauma, isolation, resettlement, and acculturation stressors. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But also it's important to know that, you know, those that are able to make the journey and arrive carry with them incredible resilience and strengths. And as providers, it's important for us to think about internal strengths that individuals carry. So thinking about their cultural knowledge, their resourcefulness, but also thinking about external strengths, thinking about their family and community support and resource they have, their, you know, degree of hope for a new life. So there's always strengths that individuals are bringing as part of that post-migration process. And I'll pass it over to Caroline.
Thank you, Vanya. Now I'm going to be going over pretty briefly. It's very general. Both these processes can be extremely complex, but just kind of for the sake of comparing the experiences of refugees, again, formal legal definition versus kind of undocumented immigrants. We're just going to be comparing them in the next two slides. As Vanya already kind of went over, there's this process of leaving home country, unknown, maybe 2, 3, 4 countries later, you know, a year, a few weeks later. At some point, there's some contact with the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And over, again, a period of time, usually years, there is, the UN is saying, yes, your fear of persecution is well-founded. We will recognize you as a refugee. And then again, there's sort of this process of putting sort of this paperwork together, this application. And if a refugee is sort of identified and slated to come to the US, in the US, we have what are called VOLAG agencies or voluntary agencies. I think there's about 9 in the US. But these agencies, they're responsible for the resettlement of refugees. They pick them up at the airport, they find housing for them even prior to arrival, and then assist them with the initial process. to even add more acronyms and agencies into the mix, there's a whole other agency, International Office of Migration, who arranges the travel itself. For many refugees, they at some point have to pay them back for often the ticket, their airplane ticket. But they are greeted at the airport by the resettlement agency. Once in the country, they're supported by this voluntary agency, and a lot happens very quickly. Usually within the first 90 days, there is securing proper documentation and identification, receiving a refugee resettlement check. It's not much. I think it's about $12,000 currently. A refugee health assessment. It is a required doctor's appointment, but it does ensure connection to healthcare. If there's children involved, school registration, beginning the process for applying to benefits, all this is done with the help typically of the agency. Can be additional cultural orientations and the like provided by that agency, and then continued case management can be for about 6 to 9 months. And I note all of this just because it differs for folks coming to the U.S. who aren't refugees, such as undocumented and unaccompanied children. Again, this is a caveat, not all unaccompanied children are crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. You can be a refugee and an unaccompanied child, but for the focuses of this youth-informed training, we're going to be taking a look at it. It does differ for folks who are over the age of 18 or adults. And it doesn't take into account recent policies such as Trump's Remain in Mexico or Title 42. But starts off the same, leaving home country, traveling by any means necessary to get to, again, in this case, speaking at the U.S. context, typically the U.S.-Mexico border. If you are a child and you are picked up by Border Patrol, you are taken into U.S. federal custody. You might have seen the images in the media of the children in the foil sort of marathon blankets in the indoor fenced-in areas. They're sort of detained legally. How things should go is within 72 hours, if you're identified for being under 18, you should be transferred to a youth shelter. At that point, things can get pretty complicated, but by and large, the process, sort of post-arrival, Vanya, if you wouldn't mind clicking, thank you, is sort of the search for either a family member or a sponsor. Oftentimes a sponsor may be located and contacted, but there's a process of verifying the relationship, and the sponsor has to take a lot of steps in the process as well. Sometimes that can't always be completed. But similar to child welfare system, family reunification is viewed as the best solution. When this is not possible, there are a few other programs, such as the URM program, Unaccompanied Refugee Minors, that might be able to place and care for the minor. I also think it's interesting to mention really briefly some statistics that I think are interesting for youth. Once apprehended by ICE, 85% are repatriated, which means even upon arrival, after they've endured what Vanya spoke about in the migration journey, many ask to return or consider voluntary departures. About 10% are reunified with family, and less than 5% receive special programming. As they're entering without authorized documents, they enter the immigration court system, have sort of these regular check-ins called master calendar hearings with the judge, but it does mean that they are in deportation proceedings, which, while the hearings themselves are mandatory to appear in person, it can be pretty an intimidating and scary process. Immigration courts themselves are extremely overwhelmed. There are years and years backlogged and waiting if you do have a pathway to legal status, especially for Central American immigrants. Again, it can be unpredictable amount of time you're waiting, even if you have applications pending, which means years of living in limbo and uncertainty. And then just to mention, that means living for years without proper documentation or access to benefits and services. This can create a lot of barriers to even basic necessities many times.
Thank you, Caroline. And even to note Caroline's point, you know, I work with many young people who have so many legal fees as well as part of that process that they pay for years to come. So I will just mention this very briefly because our entire next training is devoted to core stressors and strengths. So if you're interested in learning more, please come see us next time. But just to highlight that, you know, what we often see as kind of core stressors, again, upon resettlement, so this pre-migration phase, is often these 4 buckets. One, the resettlement piece here. So thinking about, you know, basic needs, finding shelter, finding, you know, a school for your child, healthcare, finances. Do I have a job? What are my legal implications? Those resettlement stressors are huge for any immigrant or refugee that arrives to a new community. And again, these are all dependent on what degree of support that they're coming into, right? So are they coming into a large city, like we are located in Boston, that is pretty resourceful, or are they coming into a small community where they're the only immigrant refugee in their community? And that can vary greatly then on some of these supports. Then we think about degrees of isolation. So do they have a social community? Do they have a mosque or a church or a place of worship that can go to, a cultural center that is from their home country, somebody that speaks their language? So all of those pieces impact both degrees of social connection, right, isolation, but also degree of acculturation, so supports that they have. Many individuals experience great degree of discrimination and racism upon arrival, especially if we think about the Trump era and how many individuals spoke of immigrants in our communities and what that meant and ramifications of that for a lot of individuals. Or we think about post-September 11th and how many in communities felt about Muslims in our communities. So all of this is great degree of impact on the level of supports that individuals get. We also think about family relationships. For many of you know, work with children, we know that children and adolescents typically learn language faster than their parents. So there can be often a change in kind of supports. All of a sudden, the child is the one that's going to the doctor's office and helping with paperwork and you know, attending to school needs of their older siblings. So some of those changes in social dynamics and within families can vary greatly, as well as cultural learning, being in a new place, and to what degree is the resettlement community similar or different from the culture that you left behind. And finally, as we talked about earlier, trauma is often a huge piece of many individuals' experiences, and can really be impacted, right, by environment they're coming into, degree of emotional regulation and what they've experienced prior to coming, and then again, degree of social support. And now I'll pass it to my colleague, Doris.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Vanja. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about my experience. I will provide a little bit of information of my background and also information of Central America background. I'm gonna talk about my personal experience and also people that I know, of course, without mentioning their names. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we talk about Central America, Central America is known for the beauty and landscapes, the culture. The 3 countries have so many things in common, but also have so many differences. For example, In Guatemala, the population is much larger. It's around 17 million versus 9 million in Honduras, and El Salvador, because it's a small country, is 6 million of people. In all three countries, the main language is Spanish, but also in Guatemala, they have this great indigenous population that they speak these other amazing languages that unfortunately we can't speak. We can't, but that would be amazing to learn. I don't think that's going to happen, but that would be really good to know. Of course, we also have differences in food. Even though we use the same ingredients, we do prepare the food in a different ways. I like to bring this example, like the tortilla. In Central America, we all eat tortillas with every dish that we have, but the tortilla is made completely different, even though it has the same ingredients. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, if we talk about economics, and I'm going to talk right now about El Salvador because that's where I am from. So more than half of the youth in El Salvador live on less than $1.25 per day. And you have to keep in mind that in my country, El Salvador, we use US dollar. So whatever you get here for $1.25, that's what you're gonna get in my country as well. And if you think about it, can you live with $1.25 per day? Can you think of providing for your family with $1.25? Do you think you can send your kids to school or provide a really good meal for dinner with $1.25? I don't think so. Because of this reason, youth have to start working at the age of 6 and 7 years old. Can you imagine if you have a kid around 6 years to probably 15? Can you see your son, your daughter going to work having only 6 years old? As you can see in the first picture that I have right here, this is a real picture. You can see that this kid, he is working and not working for himself. He's working for his family. So he is providing for the entire family, and that's the reality that we have to face every single day in Central America. Many children struggle to attend to school because they have financial needs and safety concerns, community violence. I always like to bring this example. When I was in my country, I used to live in a very small village, but unfortunately, this village was divided by two gang members. I used to live in the 18th Street side, but my school was in the MS-13 side. So for me to cross that invisible border was really hard because I didn't know if I was going to make it to school or if I was going to make it to my home, because I didn't know if the MS-13 wanted to kill me because I lived in the other side, or vice versa. Young children might work in the street selling candies or anything that they can sell. And this is a reality that we all have to face because children have to provide for their own families. And if you think about why parents have kids if they're not able to provide for them, that is a big question. And I asked that question to myself many times, but that's a question that I cannot answer. Older children might work in restaurant, cane plantations, or be employed as a domestic servant. These jobs are really dangerous for everyone. And can you imagine your kid working as a domestic servant when they are supposed to be in the school, when they're supposed to be learning? They are working for somebody else to provide for the family. Next slide, please. And if we talk about healthcare, I didn't even know what healthcare was when I first arrived. Youth, they don't have access to sufficient nutrition, water, or sanitation services. If you live with $1.25 per day, do you think you're gonna be worried about sanitation services? I don't think so. You're gonna be worried about the water that you drink if you only have $1.25. No, you're gonna drink the water that you have without thinking on what's in it. You're gonna be thinking on, okay, so I wanna eat this nice meal, but you don't have money to pay for it, and you don't have money to provide for everyone in your family, so you can't think of that. Limited access to physicians and dentists. So when I first came, I didn't understand why I had to go to the doctor to see my doctor at least once per year. I wasn't sick. I was like, no, I'm not sick. So why do I have to go if I'm not sick? So because the only time that you go to the doctor is when you are really sick, and when your grandma's tea or your mom's tea doesn't work. That's when you go to the doctor. And when you go to the dentist, yeah, you only go to the dentist when you have a like extremely pain that you can't handle it anymore, and any pill doesn't solve the problem. Like, that's when you have to go to the dentist. So for me, it was really hard to understand that, yeah, I have to go to the dentist twice per year. So I was like, why do I have to suffer twice per year if that's something that I don't need to do? Now I understand that I do, but many people don't, because we don't really do that. Mental health care is extremely limited. I didn't even know what trauma means. When my therapist told me that I had trauma, I was like, what is trauma? I didn't know, but that made sense why I cried every single day, and I didn't understand why. I had trauma and I didn't know. So how people are supposed to know when that is a big taboo about trauma? Like, if you talk to a therapist, that means that you're crazy in my country. But that is not real. But you have to make them understand that, and you have to let them know what it's happening and why they need therapists for.
We have to add a supplement module, or some type of.
If we talk about community violence,
Some languages.
if we talk about community violence, unfortunately, El Salvador has one of the highest rate of criminal activity in the world. The murder rate is extremely high. Around 95% of the violence is gang related. So can you live in a country like that? Can you leave your son, just think about this. Your son, 6 years old, have to go out in the street to sell candies in a really, really dangerous country, without thinking that your son or your daughter is going to jump into the bus, sell the candies in the bus, and then jump out of the bus when the bus is running. Can you imagine that? It's hard to imagine if you haven't seen it, but I saw it. Like, I saw this problem every single day in my life, and I thought that was normal. Now I understand that that wasn't normal for me or for anybody else. And if we talk about what are the reasons for leaving, of course, fear of gangs, crime, violence, family reunification, employment, abuse. If you can see that little house, like the bottom picture, that is a real house. That's not a playhouse. That is a real house. In that house, many people live. Can you think yourself living in that house? with your own kids? I don't think you can, because it's something that it's very unbelievable to think about, but that is real. And if we think about family reunification in this country, you can see the first picture. That's what a family reunification looks like. But unfortunately, it's not the same case for everyone. If I talk for my own case, I came alone. I was 18 years old. I came by myself, and I had to live in a shelter because I didn't have a stable room to live, because I was like renting rooms, and I didn't speak the language at all. I did not speak the language at all. Everything was really hard for me to work under the table, to go to school, and to provide for my family, because I was a daughter, but I was also the mother for my siblings and the mother for my own mother. So, and if we talk about what the youth might miss, from my experience and from my siblings' experience, because my two sisters are here with me as well, we miss our family. We miss food, the natural beauty, country, the culture, and the place that we grew up. Every single Friday night, we have a taco night with my family. And we always talk about going back all together, but we can't. I mean, I can go now, and thank God my 21-year-old sister can go as well. She finally got her green card this year, so she's able to go. But my 12-year-old sister that recently came during COVID, she can't go. And do you think I can leave her here by herself for me to go back home? No, I can't. So in our mind, we think on the day that we can all go back together and visit our mom and our brother that is 4 years old back home. So yeah, we do miss family. We do miss food, because even though you can cook the same food here, it doesn't taste the same. And this picture is one of my favorite pictures in the world. These are just few of the people that helped me so much when I first arrived to this country. These people are from Somerville High School, and without them, I wouldn't be here today, because they believe in me. They believe on something that I didn't believe. But I thought myself, if they believe in me, it's because they see something that I'm not seeing. So if they believe in me, I'm going to do it, even though I'm not believing on what they believe. So the guy right there is my fiance and the father of my beautiful child that I love with all my heart. The person in the left side, her name is Anne, and she was the most wonderful woman in Somerville High School that I met. She helped me so very much. And she was the one who was calling me every single day that I missed school for me to be in the class. And I didn't understand why she called me, because I was really tired from work. But thank God that she did, and thank God that I followed her rules. And the other two amazing ladies right there, the one with the orange shirt, she was my English professor. She left Massachusetts to live in Florida. And that day I met her, I was pregnant. So I met her, I saw her again, and she was very impressed with my language, with my English, and she was very happy that I learned. And I learned because of her, because she believed in me. And the other amazing woman that is right there, she helped me so very much with everything that I did. And we keep in contact, because I cannot even express how happy I feel right now to have those angels on my way.
Thank you, Doris. You could have just done the whole presentation. You didn't need us here. So as we close out and before we move into our discussion, we wanted to just put some highlights that I think speak to what Caroline talked about, what Doris talked about, what I spoke about during the phases of journey, and what can you do as a provider if a young person or child or family walks into your office or your school. So first and foremost, we always first have to establish safety, psychological safety, physical safety. As we've seen, many refugees, immigrants have experienced a tremendous amount of trauma and loss and instability. So creating a safe space is critical to any work that we're going to do moving forward. Second, it's so important that we always focus first and foremost on strengths and sources of support. What are their strengths? What are their sources of support? And really establish our clinical work through that lens, first and foremost. There is a tremendous amount of loss, but at the same time, as Doris shared, and as we've shared about other individuals, there is also a tremendous amount of hope and strength as well. It's also critical that, similar as we've talked about in our last two trainings, to integrate cultural and community values in everything we do, to take time to learn where our children and families are from, what they're bringing with them, to bring in their food, to bring in their language, to bring in their culture into your sessions, into your dialogue, to ask them, to take time for you yourself to research, to take time to connect with, cultural brokers and navigators in your communities and centers. It's so important that we start there, all of our work. It's also important that we attend to resettlement stressors. It's so easy as providers to just jump into the trauma and the trauma narrative. However, none of that work can be done until we meet and assess basic needs. So often the first work that we do is lots and lots of case management. Whether it's calling, to make sure that the young person you're working with has a home or has access to food or has that card to take transportation, or like Doris was saying, to call them to make sure they get to school. All of those kind of basic needs and basic supports to get them adjusted to this new place always take precedent. And often what I found is that you will build so much strength, trust, and rapport just by doing that, because that's what's most important to them right now. So it's important that we then center the work around that first. It's also important that we really assess informal and formal degrees of social support. As Doris said, is the individual here by themselves, or are they living with other people? Do they know those people? How long have they known those people? Do they have other family members or community members they're in contact with, where they live in the United States as a whole, or family back home they're in contact with. So really assessing what does their life look like before they walk into your office. My favorite question I often ask is when I meet somebody new is that, tell me what your journey was like coming into my office or coming into school. And that can really set a tone to tell you a little bit about what they're experiencing day to day. It's also important that we examine the role of acculturation, and especially when we think about identity. And I always say, as a refugee myself, this is a lifelong journey, that at every stage of development and every change that immigrant refugee experiences, there are new pieces of acculturation adjustment that we grapple with. So it's important to put that into context. It's important to assess, again, as we're talking about isolation, the degree of racism and discrimination they may have experienced. I talked to a lot of young people, especially from Central America. They said, we didn't know what race was until I moved to the United States. So talking about that, exploring that, and thinking about what does that mean for them is really, really important. It's important to assess caregiver capacity, needs, and supports. I do a lot of work in schools, and it's so easy for us to just focus on the children and youth in front of us. But we also know that parents, caregivers who are with them are kind of the backbone of children and youth. So making sure that we connect and we assess their own capacity and needs and supports as well. And then after all of this is done, really examining psychological distress through really the lens of their migration journey, cultural and ecological context, right? That it's not just a trauma narrative, but this is like we've said in the beginning, really rooted in cultural ecological systems that they have experienced, right? And the stress along the way, and then teasing those apart and understanding where they fit in that narrative. It's also important, and we always encourage you to connect and collaborate with community organizations, whether cultural or those organizations that are working with immigrants and refugees, and learning from them, and also collaborating with them. Maybe there's an after-school program, maybe there are basic needs they're able to provide, or transportation or language supports. So always connecting with those in the community that are doing this work, because this work can be lonely and this work can be hard. So it's important that we connect. And finally, and most importantly, so much has been taken, as we've learned today, from immigrants and refugees. So much of what's happened, they have no choice or say in. So I always say that it's important to, root our work in choice and empowerment, and allowing them to create a narrative and story that they want to create, and not one that is imposed on them by us as providers, or really, frankly, anybody else. So I think that is our last slide, and I'll pass it back to Caroline.
Thank you. Yes, I think we will go into our Q&A now. So if you have questions, please populate them in the chat while we wait for you to do so. One last mention, if you go to the next slide for me, Vanya, about our next upcoming training, Monday, April 11th, noon Eastern, will be on the slide, actually, of the little web that Vanya spoke about. It'll be a whole training dedicated to that, refugee and immigrant core stressors and strengths. And with that, and yes, and as always, any questions about our series or this training or anything else, please feel free to contact me and my colleague Osa Bisa, who I will turn it over to now to kick off our Q&A. Osab?
Thank you. And thank you to all our presenters. That was absolutely a beautiful presentation. Even though I'm part of the team, I was like, continue talking, please. So thank you all. And if you have any questions, please put it on the chat. We already have some questions, so we'll start with those. Can you clarify, one of the first questions is, can you clarify the difference between forcibly displaced person and a refugee?
I can jump in because I saw that question. I meant to answer it and I didn't. So, all of these populations are forcibly displaced, right? That is an umbrella term that we use for immigrants, for refugees, right? That all of these populations, that think about the definitions that Caroline walked through, they're all leaving due to some form of fear or inability to stay where they are. Internally displaced, meaning that they stay in their country, right? So they stay in their home country. They may leave their home, but they stay internally. Refugee, meaning that they leave their home country. So they may be going again to a neighboring country, right? They may be crossing the border, and or they may be leaving really far and going, across the world to another resettlement place.
Thank you, Vanya. Hopefully that answers the question. Let us know if we haven't answered 100%. The next question is there anything that can be done to make the process easier? The process of migration, I'm assuming.
I think that slide that Vanya just mentioned really kind of goes over what you can do as a provider once folks are here. It's really creating that welcoming environment. In terms of maybe politically or even policy, things are ever changing, and I think As much as really great things are happening, such as here in Massachusetts, the Work and Family Mobility Act is really close to passing. That's getting undocumented immigrants driver's licenses. Those things are really exciting. But at the same time, I think in the media, there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. So I think it's always evolving and ever changing. And I think it's just bringing it back to what we all can do to kind of take on roles of cultural humility and trauma-informed care.
Thank you, Caroline. Audience, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat.
I can just add one more thing, Osab,
Sure.
to that question.
Please.
I think it's also really important for us as providers to understand these laws and understand what protections exist and what don't. So I'll give you an example. I work a lot with young people who are undocumented, and even getting them opportunities to volunteer in their communities and to connect almost always requires some form of documentation. And unless you do this work and unless you know those legal statuses and what's available and what's not, it's so easy for us to just assume and say, oh, you can get connected in the community, you can do these things. Why aren't you engaging? So I say that is that if we understand those laws and we understand how much those laws really inflict many individuals' ability to get connected into communities, to thrive in their communities, to feel support in those communities, then we ourselves can also advocate for change in those systems, or to reach out to these different centers who I think sometimes don't even realize that, like, by asking individual their status, by asking individual to provide certain documentation, you're immediately putting walls up for many young people who are living in your community. So I think us learning that, but also then raising awareness with those agencies that we know could benefit, that our young people could benefit from connecting with.
Vanya, you actually, this is a perfect segue to a question that I wanted to ask. I mean, I know being a refugee myself, it can be really sensitive for people to directly ask you, what's your status, right? And to also like not sure whether or not you should share that information with the person. What is the best way to gather this information, like the person's status? Any tips or strategies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a really important one, because in many cases it's not appropriate to directly write out and ask. It can actually increase, really put up more barriers of trust and create more fear when you're trying to do the opposite in a session with a client. I think, again, doing probably a lot of the work you already naturally do as a provider. Like I said, doing the cultural humility work of doing a little bit of research on the socio and political climate of the home country of your client is important. I can also think of just asking some of the natural questions of, who is at home for you, and both home being where you're living right now and also back home in your home country. I can see asking questions around, what do you have any other formal supports in place? What other kind of types of appointments do you have? And just really trying to put kind of some of the pieces together. And then I also like to just kind of do a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really starting at, do you have the basic needs? Do you have everything that you need? Do you have a way to access those things? And kind of going about it kind of backwards in that way.
Thank you. I can ask you another question. Questions are definitely coming through. You talked about different migration journeys refugees go through. During the post-migration, how can host communities and providers listening to this presentation create a welcome environment and show compassion?
There's so many things. Can I jump? And maybe all three of us could like share, because I think this is a big question. And I think it ties to the questions that just came in too about schools and supports. I think for starters is not making assumptions of what we know or don't know is first and foremost. So, you know, no matter who the individual is, taking time to get to know them, taking time, again, I work in a school setting, so I think about, you know, do you have a point person they can connect with once they arrive into your building? Does that person speak their language? If it doesn't, who can you connect with in the district who can? Is there somebody within that community that you can connect with that can help you understand the cultural context of the individual that's coming in? Absolutely translating as much as you can. It's in fact illegal not to translate documents for families, whether it's health documents or legal documents for schools. So really taking time to do that, providing a sense of orientation, and you know, asking some of these questions that we were talking about, key considerations about what was home, you know, what was schooling like in your home country. So you kind of have a sense of, were there gaps in their education? If so, for how long? What kind of classrooms are they used to? So really getting a sense of what they're coming in with, as well as providing, not assuming that they know the system that they're coming into. So really taking the time to, you know, even have, I think visuals are great. So as many visuals as you can have, the better, but also make sure that those visuals are representative of the individuals that you're working with. So if you're working with a large Muslim population, and if many, you know, individuals are coming in wear hijab, then please make sure that the pictures and the representation of those individuals in the photos so they can see themselves. So really taking the time to kind of set the stage, provide some context of what school looks like. Mentoring programs, I think, are amazing for a lot of, especially young children and youth that are coming in. So connecting with somebody, hopefully somebody who's from their country, but if that's not possible, connecting with another peer that can help them navigate their new place. So a lot of this early resettlement stuff, I think, is just, and then assessing for those basic needs. I can't say that enough. You know, do you have those basic needs? And always kind of looping back to that in the beginning. And I'll pass it on to either Doris or Caroline to add more.
I can add something as well. Trust. Trust is the biggest part, because if you don't build trust first, no one is going to speak with you. And I always say this because it was really hard for me to trust people that actually wanted to help me, because I didn't trust them. I didn't trust that they wanted to help me without wanting anything back from me. So I feel like a smiley face doesn't hurt anyone, but also can change the day of the person that is right in front of you. I know that we all have bad days, we all do, but if we give a smiley face to someone that it's probably having a worse day than you, that might change the scenario for you and for the person that is in front of you. And also sometimes when people ask me if I have what I need in my house, sometimes as right now, I don't get anxious. But when I first arrived, I got very anxious because I didn't know what to answer. Because I was like, if I say that I don't have what I need, what they're going to do with me? Are they going to send me anywhere else? Or are they going to do something with me? Or, you know, like those kind of things. So I think it's good for you to say, if you don't have it, let me know and I can help you. I will help you to find the way for you to get what you need. And you can say you can trust me, because that is the first sign not to trust someone, but you can also encourage them to trust you in a very good way.
Yeah. I would really echo what Vanya and Doris just says. Don't make any assumptions, even if Especially I've seen a lot of assumptions made on biological age of, oh, you're over 18, you should know this. No assumptions. I would say go slow. Especially if there's a language barrier, get super comfortable and have a lot of patience in repeating yourself. Folks immediately upon arrival, there's a lot that's new. There's 1,000 things that are new every day. And so to just kind of keep that in mind and be patient with repeating yourself. Along with that, if there's a language barrier, get pretty comfortable if you don't have a shared language, acting things out and being creative in really gesturing kind of wildly or labeling things, being overly kind of intentional when giving directions, for example. And yes, I think Doris really hit the nail on the head with the trust piece. Don't overpromise, don't make false promises. The biggest way I think I've found to establish trust is to do the things you say that you're going to do. And if you can't do them, then it's not worth saying. So.
Thank you all. I am being mindful of time. I know it's 1:30. There are a bunch of other questions that came in, but unfortunately, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I will turn back to you, Caroline.
Yes, thank you all for attending today. Like I mentioned, in the coming days, you'll be receiving 2 emails. One will be a follow-up to this session, slides, recording. If you want CEUs, there's a post-survey link, so please fill that out to receive the CEUs, as well as an invitation to our 4th session in the series, as we mentioned, Monday, April 11th, noon Eastern, on the topic of refugee and immigrant core stressors and strengths. So again, thank you very much.